This episode is brought to you by Nordstrom. Summer's almost out and fall's calling. Luckily, Nordstrom has everything you need for the season ahead, all under $100. Discover new arrivals from your favorite brands like Mango, Princess Polly, Wave, Free People, BDG, and more. Whether you're planning a last-minute getaway, heading back to class, or refreshing your office looks, you'll find the latest trends and beauty must-haves without breaking your budget. It's easy, too, with free shipping, free returns, and in-store order pickup. Shop today, in stores, and at Nordstrom.com.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Capital Confidential podcast. I'm Casey Seiler, editor of the Times-Union, and I am happy to be turning the tables on Brendan Lyons, our managing editor for investigations and our Capital Bureau chief, about a very large story, possibly the longest story that's run in the Times-Union, maybe in my 21 years at the paper. About 4,700 words under the headline Broken Bolts, an investigation that Brendan has been working on for about 8 months into a whistleblower's claims that a significant and potentially very serious structural flaw on the Tappan Zee Bridge replacement, that is formerly known as the Governor Mario M. Cuomo Bridge, was covered up by engineers working on the construction of the bridge, allegedly. Brendan, if this story were a movie, could you describe for us what the opening scene would be, which is, of course, the one that you chose to open the story with?
Sure, that was a scene that happened in January 2016. They were roughly at a halfway point, I think, at that time, with assembling these massive girders that support this 3.1 mile structure. They were being assembled at the port of Queens in southern Albany County. There was a staging area there, a massive operation to assemble the girders, load them finished onto barges, which would bring them down to the bridge site about 100 miles south. And Jimmy Jordan, who was one of the more experienced iron workers on that job, he was tightening a bolt, and he was going through the torquing process that they do. And when the bolt snapped, it flew into the air because of the pressure that are put on these bolts from these torque wrenches, these electric torque wrenches. It flew into the air, and he looked up, which iron workers usually know not to do, and it slammed him in the face and split his lip open and injured him. That scene led to the safety manager at the port taking information and investigating what happened and why did a bolt break. And during the course of that inquiry, he learned that bolts had been breaking for months, if not longer. And he began interviewing people, including engineers, foremen, and others, and discovered that they were not interested in having the quality assurance inspectors know about this situation. And that safety inspector, James McNall, consulted an attorney and apparently began recording his conversations with some of these workers. Not long after that, he met with Ken Riley, who was an inspector, a quality assurance inspector for a company called Alta Vista that had been hired by the Thruway Authority to keep watch, along with others, the inspector general and others, of what was going on at these job sites to make sure that everything was done according to contract, according to regulations, according to the law. And Ken Riley, when he learned of the conversation that James McNall had with the engineer in charge, opined that it could be criminal, and an investigation was launched. And that was 5 years ago, a little more than 5 years ago.
Just to pull out a little bit for the widescreen, we are talking about one of the biggest infrastructure projects in North America at the time that the Mario Cuomo Bridge was under construction, and I think even still to this day. But it was more than that. I was down at the Capitol while the bridge was getting developed, all through the construction process. It became quite literally a symbol of sort of Andrew Cuomo's New York. I can remember at the 2016 Democratic Convention, the logo that was sort of branded on every event, on every piece of merch that the state Democratic Party was putting out was of the bridge. The governor was turning it into a symbol of noticeable, big thinking progress getting made, shovels going into the ground in the biggest possible sense. What then did this investigation develop? When, in other words, did the state get involved, and how did that process run?
Well, the state inspector general's office began an investigation that year in early 2016. The Thruway Authority, which was the overseer of this job, the agency, the authority that had contracted with Tappan Zee Constructors, it's really a consortium. It's an LLC made up of 4 to 5 companies that came together to do this $3.9 billion project. So an investigation was launched, and as part of that work, as it went along, as it extended into 2017, Alta Vista, who is the watchdog for the state and is a firm out of California that's been around, I think, about 6 years, they also conducted their own tests on these bolts. They did some random sampling on a very small number of bolts and determined that it did not appear to be hydrogen embrittlement, and that they thought that the bolts are safe, and that may be the case, but that resulted in some blowback from the whistleblower, James McNow, and his team, when they looked into and hired their own experts as part of a key TAM case.
Let me just stop you there. You use 2 terms that listeners might not be familiar with. The first is hydrogen embrittlement. And of course, the second one, for the non-lawyers who are listening along, might be a key TAM case.
So hydrogen embrittlement is something that has been looked at deeply in these investigations, and multiple experts have opined on whether or not those bolts that were manufactured in Pennsylvania and shipped to this job site could have had some sort of defect in them, and that those defects might be microscopic fissures in the bolts themselves, and that can be a result of how they were sealed, possibly not sealed the right way. Sometimes these bolts have coatings on them in the same way brake liners might have coatings on them to make them last. And so if you get these tiny cracks and fissures, hydrogen atoms can get into those cracks, and they start, like Pac-Man, they start to eat away at the integrity of the bolts. And that can take a short amount of time, or it could take years. That is in question now, because even one of the state's own experts that they hired opined that it could be and seemed to be a result of hydrogen embrittlement. Bear in mind that the iron workers we interviewed, none of them that I spoke with had been interviewed by any investigators. And these are iron workers who worked on massive projects like the Global Foundries campus in Malta, where millions of bolts were put in. And they said in that job, there were no bolts breaking that they could recall. But in this job, there were hundreds, if not more, of bolts breaking. And they would be gathered up when they hit the ground and put in a scrap pile. And according to the whistleblower's investigation, that was done by design to conceal them from the quality assurance inspectors. Those bolts were then being replaced under cover of darkness sometimes by the engineers and foremen. And in one instance, they took a tugboat in the middle of the night out to a barge where a finished girder had bolts that had snapped and were laying on the barge beneath the girder. And they were replacing those bolts on President's Day in 2016 when there was no quality assurance inspectors around, because the job was supposed to be on hold that day. So you fast forward, and in, I believe it was March 2017, roughly a year after the whistle was blown, and there was a lawsuit filed under seal in Westchester County in state Supreme Court, in which it was alleged that the company had been concealing from inspectors that bolts were breaking and replacing them secretly, which was in violation potentially of the law, but certainly of their contract. that require them to disclose these sorts of things. So that False Claims Act, it's a lawsuit filed under the False Claims Act, a complaint, and that remains under seal until the state of New York determines whether or not they will intervene in the case. And in this case, they ultimately did intervene, but not until last December of 2020. And they reached a settlement with Tappan Zee Constructors that remains under seal.
Who are the agencies that are supposed to investigate something like this? A case of, as you've described it, potential fraud on a large infrastructure project like this?
Sure. So this became a group effort between the State Attorney General's office, the State Inspector General's office, and the Thruway Authority. Those investigations may have been thorough. It's unknown. You know, when we tried to reach the Attorney General and the Inspector General's office to ask them about their investigation, to talk with them about the thoroughness of it, they did not respond to us. And in part, I think they're invoking, the fact that the case remains sealed. And that's the reason they cannot speak to us about this.
You obviously, this is a story that ran about 4,700 words. You've been working on this story for months. We put it up online on Sunday morning, along with a timeline, a visual capsule description, as it were, of the major events in the case. What has been the reaction that you've seen? I know some of it from public officials who have read the story. We're talking Monday afternoon, so it's still kind of early days in terms of the response. But what have you seen?
Well, the first reaction came, of course, from the Senate Majority Leader in the state of New York, Andrea Stewart-Cousins, on the Sunday that the story came out on on March 7th. Stewart-Cousins had issued a statement calling on the governor to resign, and she cited three issues that are hanging over him right now. One is the FBI investigation of the state's handling of nursing homes and its policies that govern the safety of those nursing homes during the pandemic. And of course, the numerous sexual harassment allegations that have been leveled against the governor. And she also mentioned that there are questions now about the safety of a major transportation project in the state. And then in addition, at least one senator has called for the Senate Investigations Committee to take this issue up and to perhaps compel testimony, gather documents, and try to find out more about this situation and whether there could be structural problems with that bridge that need to be ferreted out.
Andrea Stewart-Cousins, as you note, included that a reference to the story in her statement. I mean, what is the nexus that could be drawn between this story to the governor? I don't want to ask you to kind of look inside Andrea Stewart-Cousins' head to see what she might have been getting at, but from your perspective, is there a line that can be drawn to the governor, or is that sort of through the Inspector General's office, which is a kind of watchdog agency that, like many other watchdog agencies in New York, the governor is seen as having an undue amount of control over?
Sure. And I think the more direct line drawn to the governor here goes from the Thruway Authority. They are the overseers of this project. They are the spokesperson for the state on this project. This is their project. These were their quality assurance inspectors. And I believe in this instance, you could even make a case that they are the client for the Attorney General's office in the case. I'm sure that any settlement would have been discussed with the Thruway Authority, which conducted its own independent tests and enlisted its own engineering firms to study these issues. The question that remains is, was the testing on a limited number of bolts in 2017, I believe, enough to ensure the security and the stability of this bridge going forward? Some experts believe that small sampling of bolts that had broken on the bridge and on the girders or while being installed could represent a problem that as many as 500,000 bolts could be suspect. And how it works is these girders are held together with a clamping force by these splices that each have about 500 bolts in them. And these are big bolts. And if one or two of those bolts break or even just weaken, then you get a little bit of a swaying effect in that splice. And that can be fatal to that connection. That's the concern. And there are instances around the world, throughout modern history of buildings and bridges collapsing due to bolts that have hydrogen embrittlement.
And we should note that you've spoken to iron workers among the dozens of people you've spoken to for this story. You spoke to an iron worker who showed us samples of the bolts that he had collected that had fissures in them that looked like they had just been pulled apart, almost like taffy.
Yes, and also a professor from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute who specializes in fasteners, is what they refer to them as, and is a metallurgist. And he looked at images of those bolts and was very concerned by what he saw. And he does not believe that those bolts were breaking due to over torquing. The way that some of them have fissures that go down through the threads, there are visible cracks in the heads of these bolts. And so one little, crack is all it takes for atoms to get inside these bolts, which are, they're sealed too. Once they're put into the bridge, they put a sealant over them that it looks almost like thick paint, to prevent them from being exposed to weather, which can be fatal for some of these bolts in the splices.
So you mentioned that there is a settlement in the case that has been reached. What are the terms, and would you view them as robust?
Well, my understanding, though they would not talk to me, is that the whistleblower and their attorneys felt that the $2 million settlement with Tappan Zee Constructors fell well short of what the state of New York should have sought in this case and received in this case. They believe that the investigation should have been in the millions of dollars to thoroughly do random sampling and test more bolts along that 3.1 mile bridge, and the problem with doing that testing is it not only costs millions of dollars, but that it also may require lane closures on the Tappan Zee Bridge. And those are the sorts of things that draw attention to the issue, right? Because reporters or others may ask, why are lanes being closed and what's going on? So that could be an issue. But the settlement is, as I understand it, is based on a limited 3-month period in 2016 when Tappan Zee Constructors were not disclosing these issues with broken bolts and concealing that they were replacing them. And that $2 million represents the cost that the state estimates it spent during that period for its quality assurance program on this bridge project.
You noted that the case remains under seal. I think a lot of people listening to this might think, you can't imagine a more significant matter of public concern than the potential structural integrity of, one of the biggest bridge in New York, as far as I know. What is the argument for either side here, from the state attorney general's office or for Tappan Zee Constructors, for keeping this out of the public eye? As you note, this case has almost entirely remained for the tenure of the time that it's been going back and forth. We should note that this was the subject of a report a couple of years ago, just merely that this action had been brought. But other than that, it's been almost completely radio silent for these many years, right?
That's right. So yes, there was a leak in the case in 2018 when a presentation, if you will, from the whistleblowers team was given to apparently multiple media outlets. And that talked about the issue with broken bolts and the whistleblowers team's concerns, et cetera. So that did have a lot of detail in it. And then in February of 2021, inexplicably, a 16-page decision from the judge presiding in the case was made public on the Westchester County Clerk's site. And that document, my understanding is that I'm not sure that it was intentionally unsealed. The case remains sealed, but that document that was made available, and we purchased a copy through the clerk's office and downloaded it. And the judge outlined much of the details of this case. It was made public, perhaps inadvertently, but it was very helpful in us advancing our story, that's for sure. And that judge's decision also noted that the Attorney General's office does not object to unsealing this case now. They do request a partial unsealing, so we presume that many documents will remain sealed. But Tappan Zee Constructors is fighting like heck to keep it sealed, invoking concerns about their reputation, about the idea that if it's made public, that terrorists might learn what weak points there are in the bridge and attack it. And also that if people are afraid to cross the bridge, it would cause traffic problems.
Traffic problems. In other words, if people perhaps had a lack of faith in the bridge, that might cause backups.
Mm-hmm. The George Washington is going to get even busier.
So I guess the question is, for people, hundreds of thousands of people drive over that bridge every day of the week. What would you say to them? I guess if you're headed down to Westchester County, are you going to be taking the Taconic, or are you going to be driving across the Mario Cuomo Bridge?
I would drive across that bridge right now, but I have grave concerns based on the interviews I've conducted and the records that I've looked at, that there needs to be more testing. Unless the state has done more testing that they're not revealing, but I don't believe that the work that they did in 2017 is sufficient to ensure the safety of that bridge for, dozens, if not hundreds of years.
Last question. I mean, you have been working on this story, as you noted in the copy, for 8 months. I think lots of people who aren't in the world of journalism might have seen All the President's Men. They might have seen Spotlight, both stories about long investigative stories, the pursuit of investigations, right? What's it like to work on this kind of a story for months and months? It is the ultimate in kind of slow cooking journalism, right?
Yes, it is indeed. The one thing about this that was challenging was getting people to talk, even iron workers. Some of them were reluctant to talk to me, in part because they're still on the job. They still need work, and they worry that speaking out and sharing their concerns on matters like this might put them in harm's way. And certainly, the scientists, many of the scientists who were enlisted to do some of these studies had signed non-disclosure agreements. So they also are very guarded in what they may or may not say. But suffice it to say, I have no idea what it feels like to give birth. But from an editorial standpoint, I would liken it to that when this story was finally able to publish.
Right on to that. Yes, I agree. And with that, I thank you for all of your good work, and I congratulate you on the birth of a 4,700 word huge Sunday takeout that basically filled up about half of the A section in Sunday's edition of the Times Union.
They're still doing research to see whether that may have broken Paul Grandal's prior record.
For word count?
For word count.
If people are looking for an investment of time, you cannot do any better than a Paul Grandal piece or a Brendan Lyons investigation. And so with that, I will thank you for your good work and thank you for taking the time to talk about it. And you've been listening to the Capital Confidential podcast, a production of the Times Union. And please remember that this story, like all the good journalism in the Times Union, is supported by our subscribers. If you are not one, please consider becoming so today. And with that, I'm Casey Seiler, editor of the Times Union, hoping you have a great week.
Capital Confidential is a production of the Times Union. Jessica Marshall is our producer, with support from the Times Union digital team and the Capitol Bureau. Our music is Goodwill, courtesy of David Lombardo.
If you're enjoying this podcast, take advantage of all the Times Union has to offer and support our efforts to bring you award-winning journalism by becoming a Times Union member today. Go to timesunion.com/subscribe